Haunted bridge. Rubbish, snorted Duncan. It's as tame as a pet rabbit's. But all the same, he kept thinking about Rusty's story.
Alrighty everybody, today's episode is a bit special. Not that it really features anything that wouldn't be found in another episode, but more that this is one of my favorite characters. Recently we've been on a bit of a narrow gauge kick, and though the answer likes to change, one of, if not my favorite narrow gauge character has always been Duncan. He's the one with the attitude, and almost every episode that featured Duncan was a favorite of mine as a kid. So to finally be able to talk about his models is honestly kind of fun, and hopefully you guys think the same. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Duncan's first appearance was in the Railway series book The Little Old Engine, which was published in 1959. His last appearance was in New Little Engine, published in 1996. And Duncan himself is a fictional Scottish narrow-gauge well-tank locomotive created by the Reverend W. Awdry. He's the number 6 engine on the Skarloey Railway, and is based on the Tallyclin Railway's number 6 locomotive, Douglas. Not just with his basis, but also with several historical events that the real-life Douglas would encounter. For example, as Douglas's tall cab scraped against tunnels, it became an inspiration for the story Home at Last. In addition, Douglas was known for being a rough rider, due to its short wheelbase. It was this that inspired Duncan's rock and roll tendencies, and the locomotive has also been used by the Tallyclin to represent Duncan in real life. These events were known as Duncan Days, and man, I really wish I could attend one. And being made by the Reverend W. Awdry, it's only right that he made a model of Duncan. Awdry's model of Duncan was an 009 scale, and the model itself was made from a GEM Douglas kit. This same Duncan model is now on display at the Narrow Gauge Museum in Wales, located near the Tallyclin Railway along with the other Skarloey Railway engines and rolling stock. In 1995, Duncan would be introduced to the 4th season of Thomas & Friends. This season placed a great focus on him and other narrow gauge characters, with a number of stories from the original books being televised. However, as I'm sure you're able to tell, the TV series did Duncan a bit differently. In the original books, all of the Skarloey Railway steam engines are painted red with blue lining, except Duke. However, to make it easier for the viewers to identify each engine, Duncan and the other characters were painted different colors. Duncan specifically was painted golden yellow with black and gold lining. And in terms of the television series, Duncan had several models, but we'll start with his O-gauge model, being his small scale one. Duncan's small model was built from brass by model maker Peter Eves, and like said previously, ran on O-gauge track as to scale more properly with the Gauge 1 locomotives. He was painted using glossy car body paint, and lined with gold and black Letraline pinstripe taping. His number and nameplates, like the others, were custom printed foil stickers. Duncan's wheels were sourced from Slater's Plasticard, with the drive wheels being Manning Wardle wheels, and Duncan's coupling rods and connecting rods would be custom fabricated from a brass sheet, which was subsequently nickel-plated to get a chrome effect. Like most narrow gauge characters, his rods didn't fit well and often gave him trouble running, and behind the scenes would give the crew quite a bit of trouble. There were 11 different facial expressions sculpted for this Duncan, although only 8 were ever used on screen, 3 of which were his forced smile, furious, and startled faces, which were left unused. These faces were first sculpted in clay, and from that resin casts were made of a silicone mold. Duncan's happy face mask is now owned by Twitter user Thomas Tankmerch. The model had a motor to power it inside of the chassis, as well as an eye mechanism. However, because of his small size, there was no room to fit a smoke mechanism or the battery and receiver needed for the RCIs. These would either have to be placed off camera or under the locomotive, or in some cases in rolling stock behind the engine. His eye mechanism used servos mounted in the cab, which was hidden by blacking out his cab doors and windows. However, because of this, nearly all driver and firemen for the small-scale locomotives were cut down the middle and plaque tacked to the engine's cab, as the servos and mechanisms wouldn't allow them to stand half in. It seems as if the narrow-gauge engines had several issues, as the metal rods which controlled the eyes in the servos were known for being cumbersome and jamming often, so sadly we're going to have to add that to the list of unfortunates. But unfortunately, it gets a bit worse. The small-scale Duncan model was predominantly used in the 4th season. It was used in the 5th season for in-between shots where they would interact with the Gauge 1 scaled characters and sets, but unfortunately wouldn't see much use past this. This model would end up being replaced with another O-gauge model, but this one being a large scale. For ease of filming and reliability, the 5th season introduced larger scale versions of the narrow gauge characters, and from seasons 6 to 12, Duncan's large scale model was used exclusively. The larger scale models were built to a larger scale than the Gauge 1 engines, but still ran on O-gauge track. They were closer to 16mm scale, but slightly larger, and just like the last, the model was made from brass. The wheels and chassis were custom machined, and the model itself was track powered, so pickup contacts were attached to its metal wheels, which ran into the motor to power it. Due to his larger size, his eye mechanism was built much better, and contained 2 servos, one for up and down movement and one for left and right movement. The eyeballs were coupled to the bracket and locked in by the faceplate, so whenever the servos were powered, the eyeballs would move in whatever direction the crew desired. The model makers were unimpressed with the original large-scale Duncan used in the 5th season, due to it having several inaccurate proportions compared to its small-scale counterpart. So during the production of Season 6, the production team decided to rebuild the model, heavily rebuilding the body shell and fitting the model with a new chassis. This Duncan would have 12 different facial expressions sculpted for him, and all used on screen. Just like the last, these faces were sculpted in clay, and from that resin casts were made of a silicone mold. In the 11th season episode Cool Truckings, a lighter weight model of Duncan was built. This was because the original large-scale model was too heavy for Madge to pull. This model didn't carry a motor, and because it wasn't built to run, the wheels themselves were glued to the chassis. The eye mechanism was also recycled from the original large-scale model, and once filming these scenes was complete, the eye mechanism was put back in the original. Duncan's lightweight model, along with his chuckling face, are now preserved and owned by Twitter user Thomas Tankmerch. The actual large-scale model itself is currently on display at Hara Model Railway Museum in Japan. Now, like a lot of other characters, Duncan did have a close-up model build. These models were required for scenes where the characters had to interact with the close-up scale figures. Duncan's was a bit special though, as his would be used for close-up whistle shots as well. Because of this, his whistle would emit smoke when required. The model itself didn't actually have a visible whistle until the 6th season episode Faulty Whistles, however, which centered around Duncan losing his whistle. Most of the close-up scale models didn't have faces, as they would never be seen, and Duncan is no exception. Unfortunately, this larger model was not really complete. However, unlike both of his O-gauge models, Duncan's front and back cutout windows had glass. His buffers were recycled from Sir Handels in Season 6, and this model would appear in the 4th, 6th, 7th, and 12th seasons. It would go through a couple changes in Season 6, like when the whistle was added, or when the cab became a bit less weathered, but overall would stay mostly the same. So, as all of you all know, in 2009, the Thomas & Friends show would take a switch to CGI. This would completely replace the live-action models. And though it took a while, in 2014, Duncan was finally created from scratch in CGI by ARC Productions, this being for the production of the 18th season. During their production of Blue Mountain Mystery, Nitrogen Studios would actually go to the Tallyclin Railway to take measurements and photographs. They wanted to use the actual locomotives as reference for the Skarloey Railway engines. Unfortunately, when Nitrogen Studios would go, however, Duncan's bassist Douglas was having an overhaul and couldn't be measured, hence why Duncan was absent all the way up until season 18. When Duncan finally returned, his CGI render was based on his original television model. Somehow, it doesn't even look like that. And because of this, he is the only narrow gauge engine to have brake pipes. He also does not have a Tallyclin styled tail lamp and does not directly resemble his basis, as we can all tell. This model sucks. I hate CGI Duncan. I hate him. Go away. Furthermore, Duncan's CGI model is not necessarily accurate and doesn't have the same proportions to his previous model era counterparts, which normally wouldn't be that big of a deal. I just think he looks so wrong, and based on the comments I got on the poll for this video, I assume you guys agree. CGI Duncan is shit. But I'm gonna play devil's advocate and say, at least he was introduced, I guess. For now, I'm gonna go right back to hating him when this is over. And just to name a few, here are some of the modifications that he went through during Season 18. He became smaller in size than both his original and his basis. He received a red running board, a permanent lamp, lamp irons, brake pipes, and outlets were added. His funnel became slightly thinner. His coupling hooks became smaller. His buffer housing shape, the landing on his square, bunkers became outdented, his cutout windows gained frames and glass, nameplates were added. There was just a lot. If there's any narrow gauge character that was butchered by CGI, it was Duncan. And it stinks to leave the video on that note, but in a strange way, it almost makes me appreciate the older Duncan that I knew when I was a kid that much more. I absolutely adored episodes like Duncan as a kid. While nowadays they may not be my favorite, the memories I have with them, the memories I have from them, and the excitements I would get from those episodes is something that's still with me. And while I really don't appreciate what became of him, it really serves to highlight how great of a character he once was, and to me still is. Like I said in the beginning, Duncan is probably one of my favorite narrow gauge characters, if not my favorite. And thankfully, this video helped to remind me a bit why. And hopefully you guys enjoyed.